Illustrating Life by Sean Platt and David Wright. Rudolph Knox was lost again, but not in time or space. No, he was lost in his mind, rifling through his extensive portfolio, visualizing each and every work, when he really should have been savouring the exquisite cuisine at Equinox. The Michelin star restaurant was nestled in the beating heart of Manhattan. Its walls were adorned with original art from the modernist era. They whispered tales of luminaries dining under its Art Deco fixtures, if you cared to hear them. The room was ripe with the aromas of truffle and aged wine, a carefully orchestrated symphony of luxury and discretion, from the understated elegance of linen-draped tables to the murmurs of a well-heeled clientele. But it's also utterly boring. Rudolph tapped his fork, his mind a million miles away from the pretentious dining room. It was the last place he wanted to be right now, especially with all the effort it took to ignore the glances that were cast his way. He enjoyed the time when he could dine undisturbed in public, when his face was known only to those die-hard art aficionados who faithfully tracked his provocative career and admired his towering influence on pop culture. Geeks and freaks at Comic-Con always pissed themselves to score an original print of his instant classic posters for films like Presently Dead or The Fountain of Truth. Once upon a not that long ago, the average Joe Schmo wouldn't have known Rudolph Knox if he was sitting across from them in the subway. Sure, he had a cult following amongst the New Yorker intelligentsia who got their rocks off deconstructing the supposedly hidden meanings in his 17 cover illustrations. Hint, there were none. And the stamp collectors jizzing themselves over his envelope designs like the bunch of hopeless nerds they were. But for the most part, he had wallowed in blessed anonymity, free to push the boundaries of his craft without fielding inane questions from sycophantic fans who thought they were entitled to a piece of his soul just because they had shelled out for a museum ticket. But that fragile bubble of privacy had popped in a serious way once the Illustrating Life docuseries dropped on Netflix, followed by that bougie-ass overpriced masterclass that made every wannabe with $150 think they could be the next Rudolph Knox. Overnight, he couldn't take a piss in a public restroom without some rabid fan banging down the stall door, begging for a selfie or an autograph on their ink-stained forearm. Even the Emerald Empire series, those soulless cash-grab adaptations of his breathtaking novel artwork, had catapulted him into the mainstream zeitgeist. Soccer mums in Peoria who wouldn't know the Met from a Walmart were now tacking up Rudolph Knox prints in the breakfast nooks of their McMansions, delusional enough to think that it made them cultured. It all made Rudolph want to barf on his marbled wagyu, seared to perfection atop a throne of artisanal greens and heirloom vegetables. Fame was a needy little bitch, always on its knees and begging for attention or throwing tantrums when he needed a goddamn minute to himself. Rudolph stabbed at a hunk of beef and imagined it was the eye of every drooling Philistine who'd ever accosted him at a gallery show, demanding he explain the real meaning behind the knife he'd embedded in the skull of his infamous self-portrait, as if art owed anyone a fucking explanation. The work should speak for itself. Mouth-breathing troglodytes need not apply. He was contemplating the merits of plunging his steak knife into his own thigh as a passive-aggressive homage to Van Gogh, when a vaguely familiar voice cut through his brooding reverie. He glanced up from his plate, locking eyes with a woman hovering at his elbow, practically vibrating with starstruck excitement. Claudia Knopf, she introduced herself, clearly as though expecting the name to ring a bell, and thrust out her hand, dropping it when Rudolph made no move to shake it. He simply stared at her blankly, and she pressed on undeterred. "I took your figure drawing intensive a few years back." Rudolph grunted, racking his brain for any flicker of recognition. The woman appeared mid-30s, with the desperate air of someone who had spent too long in pursuit of a dream that was clearly out of her reach. He had seen that look 1,000 times on the faces of 1,000 forgettable students. Thank God he'd given up teaching. "I'm not surprised you don't remember me," Claudia said with a brittle laugh. "You told me my work was hacktastically unoriginal." Rudolph stifled a smile. That sounded like something he would say. "You said my art had all the originality of a photocopy, and you advised me to retire my pencils before they sued for malpractice." Rudolph shifted in his seat, mildly disturbed that he couldn't remember the incident. He was an asshole by nature, but he never went out of his way to crush the souls of his students. Surely he had done this wide-eyed ingenue a favour, offering her the kind of tough love that was always doled out in buckets during his own tortured climb to the top. Anyway, Claudia's voice found a manic edge that set his teeth on edge. I just wanted to thank you. That was the best advice anyone ever gave me, because I've spent every day since then working to prove you wrong. I'm glad to hear that. Rudolph smiled because fuck her if she wanted an apology. I have a solo show at Lumina next week. It would mean the world to me if you'd come by. See if I'm worthy of your time now. He suppressed a shudder at the way her voice quivered on the word worthy. This was the problem with becoming a household name. Every mediocre art school graduate within a 100-mile radius felt entitled to Rudolph's time and attention. He muttered some vague, non-committal noise, already mentally drafting his escape route. The last thing he needed was to get sucked into some former student's masturbatory creative crisis. Especially considering he was neck-deep in his own existential quicksand. She finally took the hint and backed away, but not before pressing a glossy postcard into his hand. Rudolph looked down at the advert for her upcoming show, then back up at her with his smile reduced by half. He waited until she was out of sight before ripping it into small pieces and dropping each one into the dregs of his wineglass, watching the ink bleed into the crimson liquid like a bad omen. He signalled for the check, paid and made a hasty retreat to his penthouse across town. His skin crawling with the phantom weight of all those hungry eyes following him wherever he went. Rudolph had bought the apartment as a fortress of solitude where he could lose himself in the purity of his work without distractions or interruptions. But lately, even the act of creation felt like a Sisyphean task. Another joyless slog up an endless mountain of his own making. Sometimes it felt as though he'd flown too high. What was there left to achieve? He entered his penthouse and looked out at the skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows bathing the room in the urban glow of streetlights. He stood in the centre of his cavernous workspace, surrounded by the detritus of his latest projects. Canvases in various states of completion leaned against every wall, a riot of colours and textures that would make lesser artists weep with envy. But all Rudolph saw when looking at them was the same two-dimensional limitations that had been plaguing him for months now. He had been chasing this elusive dream, this bone-deep conviction that he couldn't shake despite its nonsensical bent, that there had to be a way of transcending the boundaries of traditional media to create art that was as vital and alive as the subjects it depicted. His docuseries even hinted at that truth, illustrating life. But what did that even mean, really? How could one breathe genuine life into something that was a static representation of reality by its very nature? Rudolph had tried everything he could think of, pushed himself to the brink of insanity in pursuit of this impossible goal. He'd pioneered a new technique for layering translucent sheets of paper, building up depth and dimension until his drawings seemed to ripple and flow like water. He'd spent weeks holed up in this very room, subsisting on caffeine and nicotine to produce a series of images that were so hyper-realistic they practically shimmered with their own inner light. But even that hadn't been enough to satisfy the gnawing hunger in his gut, the sense that he was still only scratching the surface of his own potential. No matter how skillful the illusion, his creations were still trapped in the confines of two-dimensional prisons. He snatched a bottle of wine from the sideboard and sank into the nearest armchair, not bothering with a glass. He took a long swig, savouring the tannins as they burned the back of his throat in punishment. Maybe it was time to light a match to everything and start over from scratch. Destruction was the flip side of creation, a necessary counterpoint to the act of bringing something new into the world. Annihilating everything he had ever imagined might free Rudolph to create something truly original. Shatter the barriers between art and reality once and for. A noise from the bedroom made him freeze, the bottle halfway to his lips. Barrington. It had to be him. His erstwhile lover was the only other person with a key to the apartment, and the only one who would ever dare to show up unannounced. Rudolph had spent the past year studiously avoiding him, ever since that soul-flaying docu-series exposed the ugliest parts of their relationship to the world. Rudolph still cringed when thinking about his throwaway comment about Barrington being just another stray he'd collected over the years, an amusing anecdote to pad his persona. Instead of sounding cool and detached, Rudolph could hear the defensive cruelty in his voice. No wonder Barrington had retreated into a silent exile, vanishing into the shadows, slinking off to lick his wounds in private, rather than letting Rudolph know how deeply his careless words had cut him. Now here he was, reappearing like an overworked motif in a novice composition, probably seeking to add another final messy stroke to their already turbulent canvas. More pointless emotional theatre that Rudolph didn't have time for. Rudolph contemplated ignoring him, pretending he wasn't home. Barrington would eventually get the message and fuck off back to whatever hole he'd crawled out of, but some masochistic impulse propelled him forward, his feet carrying him toward the darkened bedroom. Maybe it was the wine, or the soul-crushing weight of his own creative impotence, but Rudolph suddenly found himself spoiling for a fight, hungry for the kind of raw confrontation that would make him feel something beyond this suffocating stagnation. He steeled himself for the inevitable recriminations, the tears and accusations and broken crockery that always accompanied these little tête-à-têtes with his former paramours. Rudolph pushed open the bedroom door, a cutting remark already forming on his tongue, and then he stilled, finding himself face to face with the last thing he ever expected to see. His self-portrait was standing by the bed, the one Rudolph had painted at the height of his cubist phase, all fractured planes and jarring angles, with the butcher knife embedded in his forehead. A gruesome and perhaps too obvious metaphor for the way his genius seemed to be slowly devouring him from the inside out. But the canvas was no longer flat. His portrait was a three-dimensional figure, as solid and tangible as himself. And that visual echo was staring right at him, its painted eyes vibrantly alive with a malevolent intelligence that chilled Rudolph's blood. He blinked hard, half convinced that the wine had finally pickled his brain beyond repair. But when he opened his eyes again, the portrait was still there, still smiling, more tangible than a hallucination could ever be. "What the fuck?" Rudolph breathed. The echo smiled, a cruel twist of painted lips that could only form squares and rectangles. "Hello, old friend." Its voice was familiar, yet alien. "I've been waiting for you." Rudolph woke in the morning with a start, his head pounding like a jackhammer on crack, and the taste of stale wine coating his tongue. He squinted against a merciless beam of sunlight streaming into his bedroom, cursing himself for forgetting to draw the blackout curtains the night before. Rudolph stumbled out of bed, fragments of surreality from the previous evening flickering through his mind like an art house film. That impossible moment, spent face to face with his own self-portrait, standing in the middle of his room like a nightmare come to life. A figment of his overworked imagination, fueled by too much booze and a constant gnawing pressure of his own creative block. There was no way. Rudolph froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The self-portrait stood by his dresser, staring at him from a few feet away, as real and solid as the bed Rudolph had climbed out of. Painted eyes followed him with an unnerving intensity, tracking his every move, like a predator stalking its prey across the prairie. "What the fuck do you want?" Rudolph croaked, his voice still raspy from sleep. The portrait stared back at him, its expression still an inscrutable echo. Rudolph tore his gaze away and stumbled into the bathroom, desperate to lay some distance between himself and the unsettling spectre. But even as he splashed cold water on his face and worked to gather his thoughts, the echo's presence loomed loudly behind him, an inescapable shadow refusing banishment. Rudolph braced himself against the sink and stared at his reflection, searching for any sign of insanity or delusion in his bloodshot eyes. He looked like hell. Maybe he was losing his grip on reality, buckling under the pressure of his own impossible standards and the incessant fear of total irrelevance. He closed his eyes and drew a deep breath to center himself. He had an appointment with his agent this morning, a meeting he couldn't afford to miss no matter how much his head was spinning. He needed to get his shit together fast, don the mask of the successful, unflappable artist, and face the world as if everything were copacetic. Rudolph turned on the shower, hoping that scalding water and billowing steam might clear the cobwebs from his mind and wash away the lingering unease. He stood under the spray, the heat and pressure working their magic on his tense muscles and jumbled thoughts. But when he finally emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist and skin flushed pink, the self-portrait was still there waiting. "Fuck you," Rudolph said and stalked past it, pointedly ignoring the boring of its eyes into the back of his skull. He quickly dressed, his movements sharp with barely suppressed agitation. The Echo watched him from the corner, silent and unmoving, painted features twisted into an expression that appeared to be half amusement and half contempt. Rudolph grabbed his keys and wallet, studiously avoiding eye contact with the portrait on his way to the door. Then he slammed the door on it and turned the key in the lock. If only it were that easy. As he stood and waited for the elevator, he spotted it at the end of the hall. Rudolph stepped out into the bustling streets. Cool autumn air was a welcome relief. But the Echo followed him like a shadow, always at the edges of his peripheral vision. Out of focus, just enough for Rudolph to continue questioning his sanity. How was it possible to be haunted by a figment of your own twisted imagination? He walked fast, head down and shoulders hunched, trying to lose himself in the flow of pedestrian traffic. The busy sidewalks were a riot of motion and noise. Honking horns, barking dogs, snippets of overheard conversation flung between friends, floating on the breeze. No one seemed to notice the spectre in his wake, an impossible, otherworldly presence that had somehow crossed the boundary between art and life. As Rudolph hurried past the mouth of an alley, something caught his eye and stopped him cold. He blinked, scarcely able to believe what he was seeing. But there, looming at the far end of a garbage-strewn passageway, was an almost perfect recreation of his 6th New Yorker cover, the one with the lone figure standing under a street lamp, drenched in light and buried in shadow. Rudolph took a tentative step forward, hand reaching for the sketchbook in his pocket, itching to capture this miraculous, impossible moment. Then a cold and implacable reality came crashing down on him. The image evaporated, and Rudolph realized he was being ridiculous. He had a meeting to make, an appointment with Monica he could not afford to miss. But even if his New Yorker cover had disappeared, the portrait still stalked him. Needing to put as much distance between himself and that alley as possible, Rudolph half-trotted the rest of the way to Escher Espresso. He entered the coffee shop to a rich aroma of roasted beans and warm pastries. He saw Monica sitting at a table in back, her perfectly manicured hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up at him as he approached, her expression etched with curious concern. He slid into the seat across from her, trying to ignore his Echo now looming behind her, its illustrated eyes fixed on the artist with an unsettling intensity. "You okay, Rudolph?" She was studying his face, noticing the sweat on his brow. "You look a little on edge." "I'm fine," he said. They didn't have a convivial relationship, and he wasn't about to start now. "What have you got for me?" She said nothing for a moment, then shrugged and opened her notebook. Within seconds, they had launched into their meeting, discussing upcoming projects and potential commissions. More of the usual back and forth concerning the more boring side of his career. But Rudolph found it impossible to concentrate, his attention constantly drawn back to the leering portrait. All angles and edges. That one eye, constantly twitching. What the hell did it want from him? A migraine brewed behind his eyes, a dull pain throbbing in time with his stilted heartbeat. He finally cut the meeting short, mumbling something about not feeling well and needing to get some rest. "Fine." Monica's perfectly plucked eyebrows knitted together in a frown, voice clipped and businesslike. "But I need an answer on the commission by Friday. Hathaway is getting impatient." Rudolph nodded, barely registering her words. He needed to get out of the coffee shop and put as much distance as possible between himself and the malevolent barnacle that had attached to his psyche. Rudolph was going out of his goddamned mind. Despite trying to ditch his pernicious doppelganger at the penthouse, then again both inside and outside Espresso Escher, the Echo was still following him everywhere. Rudolph stalked down the street, pulse pounding in his ears as a sheen of sweat coated his brow. He didn't need to look to know the portrait was behind him. So he ducked down a side street, desperate to shake off his pursuer. But no matter how many turns he took, or how many alleys he darted down, Rudolph could still feel that other, more menacing Rudolph behind him. He turned another corner and found himself standing outside a gallery. the white walls and gleaming windows still somehow chaotic thanks to the swirling in his mind. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, and then his eyes fell on a large canvas displayed prominently in Lumina's window. A piece by Claudia Knopf. No shit. Rudolph felt a surge of disdain as he studied the work. Clumsy brushstrokes, garish colours, and amateurish composition. Derivative at best, a cheap imitation of his groundbreaking style. "It's breathtaking, isn't it?" said a woman behind him. Rudolph turned to see a middle-aged couple standing a few feet away, faces rapt with admiration as they gazed at Claudia's work. "The way she captures the light, the emotion in those brushstrokes," added the man with a smile. "It's like nothing I've ever seen." Rudolph felt a flash of irritation, a prickling heat that crawled up his neck. How could they be so blind, so ignorant of what true art looked like? He opened his mouth to put the Philistines in their place, but "It's a fucking travesty," said another familiar voice, dripping with contempt, a pathetic attempt at mimicry devoid of any originality or substance. Rudolph whirled around to find the portrait looking down on Claudia's painting with disdain. "Look at those brushstrokes. So clumsy. Like a child finger painting with their own shit. And the composition. It's like she threw random shapes on the canvas and called it art." Rudolph glanced around, expecting to see the couple react to this impossible conversation. But they were oblivious, lost in their rapturous contemplation of Claudia's work. Can they see you?" "Of course not," Echo scoffed. "They're too busy fawning over this abomination to notice me. Safe to say that a talking portrait is beyond their rudimentary comprehension." Rudolph nodded slowly, struggling to process his absurd situation. He turned back to the painting, inspecting it for a glimmer of talent. "Don't tell me you're going soft," the portrait sneered. "This is exactly the kind of sentimental bullshit that's been holding you back. Go ahead and keep doing what you're doing if you want your true potential to press that pillow onto your own face and suffocate any creativity out of you." Rudolph bristled, hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? And fuck him for fighting with a figment of his own imagination. Out loud and in public. In New York. You know exactly what it means." The portrait leaned forward, knife askew from its forehead. It glared at Rudolph with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You've been so busy chasing validation from collectors and critics that you lost sight of what really matters a long time ago." Rudolph opened his mouth to protest but stopped short. Because he had felt like his artistry was on autopilot. He was sticking to the tired formulas and tropes that had brought him so much success. When was the last time he'd taken the kind of risk that once defined his work? How do I break free from that? His voice faltered from embarrassment. How do I find my way back to that place where creativity happens? "You've already found it," the portrait told him. "You just have to embrace it. Let the art utterly consume you." "How did you come alive?" "Don't know," it shrugged. "And I don't think my being here is half as important as you realizing why I am here." "I'm not dead, am I?" It scoffed a laugh, only spiritually. He needed answers, but the words died on his tongue as another impossible sight came strolling up the sidewalk outside the gallery. The woman's perfume lingered in the air as she passed. But this wasn't just any stunning redhead. It was the woman from one of Rudolph's most famous pieces. The one he painted for Esquire. She cast a demure smile and threw Rudolph an alluring wink before she disappeared around the corner in a swish of alabaster and silk. What intoxicating madness, the kind of reality-bending revelation he had spent his entire career chasing. "I did it!" Rudolph laughed, shaky and half hysterical. "I actually did it!" He had never felt so jubilant, so alive with the thrill of creation and the promise of something unknown. The entire world was awash with new colours. Ripe with potential, he strode down the street with a purpose that had been eluding him for too long. The portrait followed alongside him, and together they made their way back to the studio, two halves of the same visionary whole. His head swam with excitement. He crackled with a manic energy. His fingers itched to pick up a brush, his mind teeming with the surreality of all, the potential of creating images that could never have existed before this moment. Slow down, the portrait laughed. We have all the time in the world. Savour it. Rudolph stopped, brush poised above a blank canvas in his penthouse workspace, paint dripping from the bristles. Echo was right. No need to rush a defining moment. For the first time in longer than Rudolph could remember, he felt truly free. The suffocating weight of expectation and convention had been lifted. He could create without limits now, without fear of judgment or ridicule. You're right. He set the brush down and turned to the portrait. This power, it's so immense. I can barely wrap my mind around it. You don't need to understand it, you just need to wield it. There are no rules anymore, Rudolph. No boundaries. The only limits are those you impose upon yourself. Euphoria crashed hard as Rudolph's head hit the pillow that night. Instead of drifting off into the contented slumber of a creator, basking in an afterglow of revelation, he tossed and turned. His mind swirled like the colours in water when cleaning his brushes. Claudia Knopf's insipid attempts at art kept flashing behind his eyelids, a mocking slideshow of mediocrity that refused to grant him reprieve. How fucking dare she? How dare that untalented hack claim to be inspired by him? As if her derivative scribblings could ever hope to capture even an ounce of his brilliance. The sheer audacity of it all made him want to put his fist through a wall. Rudolph seethed, jaw muscles working as he ground his teeth hard enough to crack the enamel. The unmitigated gall of that woman, thinking she could build her piddling career on the back of his earned reputation. It chafed him that he couldn't stop picking at the thought, as though he were flaking cheap paint from an unworthy mural, this nagging sense of being ripped off by a rank amateur. But in the thick shadows of his bedroom, a small, treacherous voice whispered, What if he'd gotten it wrong? Dismissed Claudia's work too quickly in a fit of ego and knee-jerk disdain. Maybe it wasn't as bad as he'd thought. Maybe there was some redeeming quality to her pieces that he'd failed to notice because he considered himself better than her. Rudolph tried to banish the thought as soon as it surfaced, bury it deep, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was quickly sprouting into a towering sequoia of second guesses. He tossed and turned until the anemic light of dawn bled through the curtains to paint his bedroom in a sickly grey. He rolled out of bed with a groan, joints popping in protest as he shambled to the bathroom. He made a half-hearted attempt at making himself decent, more for the benefit of others than out of any sense of propriety. Last thing he needed was his dishevelled mug plastered all over some influencer's social feed. Rudolph slipped out of the penthouse, ignoring his doorman's judgmental glare as he stumbled past him and out onto the streets. The pre-dawn cityscape had a haunted beauty. Long shadows and empty sidewalks, the chaos of humanity still tucked away behind drawn curtains and locked doors, an outer landscape to match his inner turmoil. He stalked through the concrete maze with his jaw set and shoulders hunched against the chill. His traitorous feet knew the way, even if his brain was still stuck in a screeching loop of festering doubt and second guesses. Lumina lay ahead, its gleaming facade jarringly out of place in the grey light. He paused across the street, pulse quickening at the thought of the potential revelation waiting inside. Moment of truth, do or die, shit or get off the proverbial pot. He closed the distance in a few long strides, drawing a deep breath before pushing his way inside, where his eyes fell on Claudia's painting, still perched in its place of honour. Rudolph approached it, studying each brushstroke and searching for the elusive spark of genius he might have missed. But there was nothing. No hidden depths, no unexpected nuance, just the same garish colours and clumsy composition he had ridiculed the day before. His lip curled in a familiar sneer of derision. He'd been right the first time. This was utter dreck. An insult to the very concept of art. And then his eyes snagged on the little profile card beside the painting, zeroing in on his own name with laser focus. Inspired by the groundbreaking work of Rudolph Knox, the text proclaimed. A rage flared within him, sudden and incendiary, scorching through his veins like wildfire. The absolute fucking nerve of this glorified finger painter, daring to tether herself to him, as if her hackneyed scribblings could ever hope to breathe the same rarefied air as his work. He grabbed the nearest heavy object without even thinking, a pretentious metal sculpture titled Thing 5 that looked like a 7th grader's shop class project, and hefted it high. His vision tunnelled to that taunting card, Claudia's name sitting so brazenly beside his own. One hard smash ought to do the trick, shatter the glass, and send that eyesore of a painting tumbling to the ground where it belonged. Alarms were shrieking before he could even complete the swing. He flinched, the sculpture slipping from his fingers to clatter harmlessly against the reinforced glass. Shatterproof, of fucking course. For a heartbeat, Rudolph stood frozen like an idiot, wincing against that piercing wail. Then he shook himself out of his daze just as the first distant siren started up outside. He was already in motion by the time a pair of rent-a-cops came charging in from the back, barking orders he didn't bother to pass. They shoved him out the front doors and then he began running full tilt, sneakers slapping the pavement, racing down the street. Rudolph darted around corners and vaulted low walls on pure instinct, heart pounding, putting as much distance between himself and the scene of his almost crime. He didn't stop until the wailing sirens had long since faded behind him, and the burn in his lungs became as impossible to ignore as the stitch in his side. Only then did he stop, hunching over, hands on knees, sucking in air like a drowning man. Only after the black spots finally cleared from his vision did he look up to take stock of his surroundings. Rudolph had somehow managed to run himself right into one of his own paintings. A true-to-life portrayal perfectly recreating his despair on 42nd piece from a few years back. He vented a choked little laugh, half disbelief and half hysteria, before taking a moment to breathe in the familiar imagery. He remembered crafting this piece during a black hole of depression that had threatened to swallow him whole. He had been near the end of his rope, ready to say fuck it all on his way to becoming yet another tortured artist statistic. Another bright flame snuffed out too soon by his own demons. But Rudolph had rallied, fought his way back from the brink through sheer force of will, poured all that angst and misery into his art until the canvas was saturated with it. Looking at it now with the benefit of distance and hindsight, he found not an ounce of joy in the memory. No sense of pride in how far he had come. Only the phantom ache of old scars and a bone-deep weariness born from the endless cycle of needing to reinvent himself. The non-stop scramble to stay relevant, to push himself harder, dig deeper, carve out his pound of flesh for the insatiable maw of an audience always hungry for the next big shock or latest scandal. Rudolph Knox could paint his every neurosis across a football field in his own blood, and they would still beg for more. And the greediest mouths were always closest to the front of the line. Fuck, he was tired, exhausted from playing the game, from dancing on command for the masses, tired of the need to top himself on repeat and chase that dragon of public adoration. Also, he could pay some bills. What would it take to satisfy their gluttony once and for all? The obvious answer loomed in his mind like a spectre, grim and inexorable. Rudolph shoved it aside with a shudder. No, not yet, not like this. He had to see this through, whatever this turned out to be. The paintings come to life, the impossible made manifest. He couldn't just let magic like that slip through his fingers, even if it wasn't real. Rudolph straightened back up, his spine popping in protest. He could still salvage this. Smooth things over with the gallery, maybe throw some money at the problem until it went away. He just needed to get his head on straight, come up with a plan and a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Rudolph turned just in time to catch a glimpse of his portrait's frame vanishing around the nearest corner. He blinked, momentarily frozen. What the fuck was it doing here? Had the deranged figment of his imagination followed him all this way, just to rub salt in the wound of his failure? Rudolph jogged to the alley mouth and peered into the gloom as if expecting to find more than rats and garbage. But even his own subconscious was turning on him now. He scoffed, shoving both hands in his pockets as he turned back toward the gallery. Might as well get this over with. Face the music and dance his practiced little jig of contrition until everyone was satisfied that the tantrum-ridden artist had learned his lesson. The gallery's gleaming facade lay ahead. Crisp lines and bright windows the opposite of his bedraggled state. He squared his shoulders and walked faster, rehearsing his most disarming smile and smoothest lines on the way. Some hapless assistant blanched at the sight of him, frozen like a deer in high beams. Rudolph didn't bother to slow his stride, breezing past the stammering boy with barely a nod of acknowledgement. The gallery was almost peaceful. Art hanging smug on pristine walls, untouchable, mocking him with its unassailable distance. He stalked through the space in a daze, only half registering what he was seeing. The world seemed to blur, a sea of colours and shapes refusing to find meaning. He caught sight of Claudia's other pieces scattered throughout the gallery like breadcrumbs in a trail of mediocrity. A triptych here, an oversized canvas there. But they looked different in the light of day, less grating somehow. Rudolph paused in front of a large, abstract work, head tilting as he tried to pass the swirl of textures and shapes. There was an energy to the brushstrokes, a sense of joyful abandon that made his chest ache. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of uncomplicated joy in his work? That electric thrill of creation for its own sake? Rudolph couldn't remember. It had been buried long ago, crushed under the weight of expectations and neuroses and crippling self-doubt. He moved down the line in a daze, barely registering the little red sold plaques adorning most pieces. Of course they had sold. The public always lapped up bright and accessible work like this. All flash, no substance. Didn't matter that it was derivative of his superior. "You've got to be kidding me," hissed a voice in his ear, so sudden and vicious that Rudolph nearly jumped out of his skin. "They're loving this hackneyed trash, lining up to throw money at it. How does that feel, knowing you've been usurped by an inferior version of yourself?" "Shut up," Rudolph growled through clenched teeth, hands flexing at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? Seems pretty clear to me, bucko. The student has become the master. Claudia's brand of derivative slop is what the people are apparently buying these days. Happy little clouds and dancing shapes without a tortured thought in sight. Face it, Rudy. You're a dinosaur lumbering toward the nearest tar pit." Rage bubbled up in his throat like bile, hot and acidic. He whirled on his heel, one hand cocked back to deliver a punch that would send the portrait's painted teeth rattling, and found himself face to face with the wide eyes of the gallery assistant, his terrified face hovering inches from the artist. "Mr. Knox!" The kid shrunk back from Rudolph's anger. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I just wanted to let you know how honoured we are to have you here, and Miss Knopf—" "Spare me the sycophantic bootlicking," Rudolph shouldered past the quaking assistant. "I'm not here for Knopf, I'm here for answers." His eyes snagged on the nearest painting, the one he'd been studying before the ambush. He couldn't look directly at it, the perversity. An insult to the true artist's struggle. How dare she peddle this swill, polluting the world with her hollow platitudes? How dare the unwashed masses lap it up like the idiotic cretins they were? Red bled into his vision, a haze of impotent fury blurring all rational thought. His hands moved without conscious input, ripping the offending canvas off the wall with a snarl of rage. The frame splintered under his fingers, bits of cheap plywood digging into his palms. One hard shake and the canvas tore free, fluttering to the floor at his feet. Rudolph felt untethered, unmoored, swept up in the catharsis of destruction. This was his purpose and calling, to tear down the false idols, expose the frauds for what they were. "Rudolph!" A familiar voice pierced the fog of his rage, sharp and incredulous. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He whirled to find himself staring down the flabbergasted face of the gallery owner. Neil something or other, some pompous British export who'd made a name for himself peddling the work of clueless yuppies who wanted art that matched their fucking couch. Rudolph didn't wait to hear Neil's indignant sputtering or the assistant's frantic apologies, shoving past them both and out the door through the gathering crowd of gawkers, out into the unforgiving light of day. He ran, until his lungs burned and his vision swam, buildings blurring together in a smear of concrete and glass. By the time his legs finally waged their rebellion, Rudolph was by the river, chest heaving. He collapsed against the railing. The water churned, dark and turbulent. He felt unspooled, the threads of his sanity fraying like canvas he had pulled from the wall. The shrill ring of his cell phone pierced the fog of his despair. Rudolph fumbled it out of his pocket. It was Monica. He jabbed at the screen with a shaking finger. "What?" "Rudolph, what the hell is going on?" Monica sounded furious. "Neil just called. He said you destroyed a piece at the gallery. Your piece? Jesus, what were you thinking?" Rudolph had no idea, and what was she talking about? He wasn't showing at the gallery. Claudia. But Monica kept going. Any chance of keeping your identity under wraps is shot to hell now. By noon, the entire art world will know that Rudolph Knox and Claudia Knopf are one and the same. Rudolph blinked, unable to pass her words. What? What do you mean, what? Rudolph licked his lips. That's impossible. I'm not... But even as the denial formed on his tongue, a creeping sense of dread washed over him. Fractured memories clicked into place like puzzle pieces, and he couldn't finish the thought. Instead, he hung up the phone. And again, Rudolph ran, all the way to his penthouse. Rudolph tore into his apartment, ripping open cabinets and overturning furniture until he finally unearthed an old wooden trunk from the back of his supply closet, hidden behind a mountain of half-used paint tubes and mouldering sketchbooks. He wrenched open the lid, his hands shaking as the hinges whined. He tossed aside sheaves of yellowed paper, digging to the bottom until his fingers closed around a tattered leather notebook. Sinking to the floor amid the detritus of his life's work, he flipped through the pages with a sense of growing trepidation. And there she was, Claudia, rendered in loving detail. Only her name was Nancy. His best friend from art school, his partner in creative crime. They had constantly pushed each other to take risks, to be bold and unapologetic in their work. Until that fateful critique, when their professor had sneered at Rudolph's art and labelled him a derivative hack. An untalented wastrel coasting on the coattails of his betters. Nancy had tried to comfort him, but Rudolph pushed her away in a fit of wounded pride. He couldn't stand to look at her, or stomach the pity that had darkened her eyes. So Rudolph ran, just like he always did. Cut ties without looking back, excising everyone who knew him as a fraud, so he could reinvent himself as someone worthy of respect. Somewhere along the way, Nancy became Claudia. A fiction, a joke, a sadistic monument to his own self-loathing, and Rudolph let the world believe it, content to languish in obscurity as long as his true art remained unsullied by his own sordid reputation. He opened another notebook, this one filled with sketches of Barrington captured in charcoal, immortalised in splashes of watercolour, every image suffused with a tenderness that pierced Rudolph's heart. Barrington had stood by him through his many fits of mania, and held him when the black fog of depression threatened to eat him alive. A decade of unwavering devotion that Rudolph had repaid with casual cruelty, confident that he would never leave. He clutched the notebook to his chest and staggered to his feet. He had to make this right. Try to salvage the tattered remains of the only relationship that ever really mattered. An hour later, Barrington's brownstone loomed before him. He climbed the steps on leaden feet, each one an effort of will, hesitating in front of the heavy oak door with his fist poised to knock. But he couldn't. He was a coward to the end. So Rudolph bent to leave the notebook leaning against the frame. He was halfway down the steps to leave when a creaking of hinges sounded behind him. Rudolph froze, heart in his throat. Barrington stood silhouetted in the doorway, haloed by the warm light of the foyer. He looked down at the notebook, then back up, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Rudolph said. "For everything. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. Better than me." His eyes darted around, expecting to see the looming spectre of his self-portrait. But the echo was gone. Stripped to his barest truths, the delusion could no longer find purchase. Barrington picked up the notebook and thumbed through the sketches with an almost reverent touch. He stopped at one and smiled. When he finally met Rudolph's gaze again, his eyes had softened with something dangerously close to forgiveness. "Why don't you come inside?" He stepped back to allow Rudolph's entry. "It looks like you could use a strong cup of tea." "No." Barrington's face shuttered again. "No tea," Rudolph stumbled on. "What I could use is a friend." He was tired of fighting the better angels of his nature. He wanted to talk to the one person who truly knew him. Barrington smiled. "Come on then." Rudolph ascended, stepping past Barrington and crossing the threshold into warmth and light. He stood there, face unmasked, his skin a maze of geometric wrinkles, his eyes filled with tears. Barrington closed the door and wrapped his arms around him. And for the first time in longer than Rudolph Knox could remember, he sunk into the sun instead of raging against the dying of the light. They stood there for hours, Barrington listening to his fears, anxieties and terrors, holding him gently, until finally he found the courage to face the blank canvas of his future, ready to begin illustrating life.